Okay, so now we're ready to glue our cores into the mounts. They've dried for several days. It's important that they do dry for several days because they can shrink and crack in the mounts if they're not dry enough. Okay, so we're going to glue our cores into a wooden mount. This is bought through a vendor, but you could make your own if you so inclined. You'd need a table router and put a groove. It's just a piece of wood with a groove cut in it, and the core will be raised up a little bit above that, and then we'll sand it down a little bit to give us a flat surface. So why don't we start with one of our oak trees, and it's important that all the information that you put down on the straw, the field data so to speak, goes onto the mount before you actually glue it in there, because we're going to be taping it up and we'll be able to write on it once the tape is there. So I'm going to transfer that information, which end is the bark end, the species, the date, the DBH, all that information. Okay. All right, so I'm going to cut the paper, straw, and usually you have to push the core out. Various implements for doing that. I'm just going to use one of my chopsticks again, but really anything that's able to fit in the straw would be able to do that. There we go. And remember, sometimes they come out in pieces, right? This one's one that got the entire core, so it's not a problem. But if it does come in pieces, you want to have all those pieces together, and you're going to end up gluing them like a jigsaw puzzle. So you have to either use a magnifying glass, if that helps, or a microscope to help you make sure that those pieces fit together. And since often we're going to be measuring ring widths, you don't want gaps between them. So again, you want it to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, so in terms of getting it mounted, it's important that it's oriented the same way that it was in the tree. In other words, we want the vessels, the tracheids, to be vertical as we're doing this. And you can, again, sometimes you can just see them with the naked eye, or you can use a magnifying glass, or again, a microscope. But it's important that the plumbing, so to speak, is vertical, so that, again, the tracheids, or those vessels, are vertical as you plant it in there. One way to help, aside from looking at the side, is that is the end of the core, is that the side of the core is often going to be rough there because the increment bore will have torn the tracheids and you'll have a rough side, or sometimes you get a very shiny side on that side of the core from the long axis of long tracheids. Okay, so you see which way it's going to go. That's very important. And we're going to just use some water-soluble glue, Elmer's glue. Any water-soluble glue will work. That way, if you do make a mistake, after you've sanded it and looked at it and you can see that it's not properly mounted, you can soak the core, the glue dissolves, and you can take the core out and remount it. If the core is twisted, this one doesn't appear to be, but sometimes it will become twisted, you can just use steam to gently untwist it, like have a little tea kettle or something that you can hold the core over and do that. So I'm going to try to be as efficient with space as possible. Don't want to waste too much core. I'm just going to put a bead of glue down there. That'll hold it down. It doesn't want to come out. There we go. Make sure it's vertical. Okay. Drop the core in. Now we need something to hold that down, whether it be a weight. Some folks will use binder clips or string, which can get kind of messy. I'm just going to use masking tape. Put it on there so that it holds it tightly. Okay. We don't want the core to start bowing up as the glue dries, so kind of wrap it tightly a couple times around, and I often will put a little fold over one edge so that when it comes time to unglue it, it's easy to grab that. And I have a bunch all ready to go here. Often handy to do that. Okay. And you can see why it was important to write that information on the mount before we started doing this. Glue takes several hours to dry, so we'll glue these guys down and then have to come back in a little bit, and then we'll be able to sand them. Okay. So we don't need to do all of them on the film here, but again, these mounts are not cheap, right? So want to minimize the amount of core that we have to use. So the next one we're going to glue right next door here. Maybe give it a 1/2 inch or so space. And so what I'll do is I'll make a little mark on here where the saw will be able to cut through. And so my next core will go right there. I'll write the information on it again. And then eventually I'll use the miter box to just saw through and have the individual samples. Okay, I've got all the cores glued in the mount, making sure that the tape kept the mount from bowing up, and if there was any broken chunks, I made especially sure to tape down at that boundary so that they stuck together. So the next step then is to cut them apart. So I'm just going to use my miter box here. And then I'll take the tape off, and then we'll be able to sand it. Okay, so we're now ready to start sanding our cores, starting first with the belt sander, which makes a lot of noise, so I've got my earplugs in, ready for that. So we're going to successfully use finer grit sandpaper. The idea is that when we're all done, we should be able to see every single cell under magnification, under 40x magnification. So successively finer and finer grades of sandpaper. So we'll start with the belt sander, and we'll do first 80 grit, then step down to 120 grit. And if I initially hold the core kind of this orientation, as I change the paper to a finer grade, I can turn it, say, on a 45-degree angle, and then I'll know that I've sufficiently sanded it down, because I'll remove the striations from the previous grid. Hopefully that made sense. So I'm going to turn this on. It's going to make a fair bit of noise. I'll put on my goggles. It's going to spin towards me, and so I want to make sure that the bark is going against the direction. So if the paper is moving towards me, I'm going to hit it this way with the bark, just so the bark doesn't come flying off the end at me, because it's not necessarily attached very well. This is just a gum eraser, so as the as the wood dust kind of builds up on the sandpaper, I can just kind of erase it. I'll show you how that works, and it just prolongs the life of the paper a little bit. Now the idea under doing this is not to take a lot of wood off. We're just making a flat surface. Right? All right, so after I finish this, then we'll step down and use the hand sanding.